Very, very happy to now pass over to our next speaker, Maja Groff. Maja is an international lawyer based in The Hague, and she's also the convener of the Climate Governance Commission, which seeks to implement global governance solutions to the climate crisis. She has assisted with the development and servicing of many multilateral treaties for more than a decade, and she's also worked at various international criminal tribunals and teaches at the Hague Academy of International Law and at Leiden University's Faculty of Governance and Global Affairs. The subject of her talk today is Global Risks and Global Governance, Values and Institutional Architecture for the 21st Century. So I believe she'll be asking the question, is the existing global governance system sufficient to tackle the wide range of social, economic, climate and global health problems facing the world today? And with that, I'll allow Maja to introduce herself. So thank you so much, Maja.
Thank you so much. And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. And firstly, just a preemptive apology for any background noise or any internet problems. I'm at the airport now. That is the only way that I could fit in the presentation. So I'm really delighted to be with you, but I apologize for any disruptions in the presentation. So I'd like to speak for about 30 minutes. Does that work? And then have about 15 minutes for discussion, questions, discussions. Malin, does that work?
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. And I'm going to try to share my screen for my PowerPoint. Oh, perfect. I think that's working. Amazing. Okay, so as was mentioned, I'm indeed going to talk about our current global risks, how adequate our current global governance is to tackle these very severe risks we're now confronting, and with a focus on values and how values can be sort of the touchstone for these evolutions. As you know, in the Baha'i community, we're very clear: ethics and principles go first, and then we should fashion our institutions after these values. So today I'm just going to go through some slides on these various perspectives. So firstly, just a word about this values context, which I think is so relevant to some of the work that I'm engaged in now, and many of the communities that are, I would say, gathering steam in terms of having really strong values-based communities, having a more and more substantial impact in international discourses and in transformations and potential transformations at the international level. I'll say a bit about the challenges we're confronting, and then I'll talk about two of the projects I've been heavily involved with recently, the creation of new International Anti-Corruption Court, and also the Climate Governance Commission that was mentioned. And if I have time, I'll share some thoughts about sort of these perspectives on transformation, how likely will we see real shifts in our shared collective governance. So, of course, Baha'i grounding, so vitally important for me and all of us, or many of us probably on this webinar. And I'm really finding many of these values, of course, among others, these principles are extremely helpful. They have an incredible usefulness on the international plane. As conditions around the world start to really deteriorate, also, what one sees is a flight to quality, a flight to values and first principles. So, for example, if a community embodies trustworthiness, kindness, loving kindness, excellence, efficiency, but with compassion, with relational wisdom, then there is a gravitation to this quality, because it is such a contrast to the deteriorating circumstances that we see in the world today. So I've just put a few, Baha'i principles here on the slide, but I think some of these are very interesting to think about, how we in discourse environments in the world, how we can involve ourselves in discourse environments, because what I'm seeing is more and more opportunities that where such sort of grounding again in these first principles is so badly needed. It is like a sort of dry soil in need of refreshing waters of insight. So, for example, the balance between material and spiritual civilization, which you don't hear in very often in mainstream discourses, but of course is so fundamental to the types of transformations and rebalancing that we need to see in the world. That religion is and should be a cause for fellowship, and then how can we explain that, and how can we get to the fellowship core of all religions, for example, etc. These are all really these are all issues and perspectives that are ripe to be kind of shared with the broader international community, in my experience. And one sort of course, very, very big insight, which we know as Baha'is, is this knowledge that as humanity, we are indeed really one family. We have a common origin, we have a common destiny, and again, this is such a perspective that is so badly needed in the world. And it's just not frequently enough raised in the different discourse environments so that it can be received. And I've been talking, for example, recently with astrophysicists and scientists or astronauts, who have this experience of having this overview effect of the Earth. Is sort of like, they describe it as sort of a mystical experience looking down at the planet. So this view of the planet as we are, indeed this one planetary community, is so vital just in terms of a survival kind of perspective for the human species at the moment. And so we have a lot to offer. And I'm just also inviting everyone to think about the various opportunities for these perspectives, to share them more widely. And then one sort of more background value, which is really important, I found absolutely crucial in basically all of the international venues and venues at all levels of governance and activity and institutions, is really the gender balance and gender equality issue. We still have so much to learn. This is an article from Institute of New Economic Thinking, talking about Janet Yellen, who's a very, very accomplished economist in the U.S., but just the barriers she had to confront, or that are confronted by women generally, and that we don't yet have the psychological maturity to really work together very deeply, shoulder to shoulder, as men and women. In my experience, this is really about psychological and emotional maturity. A lot of work needs to be done, which has then institution and governance consequences. So just flagging that also as like a very important background issue if we think about the types of governance we need to see in the future, along with, of course, abolishing all the various prejudices that, for example, Abdu'l-Baha talks about in the Tablet to the Hague and elsewhere. How do we really dig into those various prejudices and find the transformative way through? So our global risk landscape at the moment is grave. The IPCC in 2018 noted that because of the climate crisis, we will need to transform the global economy at a speed and scale that has no documented historic precedent. And of course, we have barely begun that work. I mean, we have started as an international community, but we are at the moment headed towards catastrophic climate change and also potentially catastrophic biodiversity loss. So if you look at this planetary boundaries framework, the scientists developed in 2009, staying within the green area is a safe operating space to be conducive to human civilizations flourishing as they are now, and also life on the planet. And we've overstepped 6 already of these 9 planetary boundaries. So this is very grave, and it's not widely understood or really known that we're really on a path to really very significant and unprecedented ecological challenge, which are quite complex, given this planetary boundaries framework and other very recent scientific knowledge. This is another statement about, how grave things are. in terms of climate change, even if we stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase, this likely commits future generation to 2 meters sea level rise, which again would be existential for many coastal cities and other low-lying areas. And also just to give like a little analogy for the risks that we're running at the moment in terms of these global risks. I really like this analogy that we've worked really hard to make flying and flights very safe, but in terms of climate change, if we compare 3 degrees global temperature increase, the risk of that would be the equivalent of 15 million people dying annually on airplanes. So we are running really, really tremendous risks. So I think this is so interesting in terms of the trustworthiness of our current leadership approaches, like what are the lack of wisdom, the lack of maturity, the lack of deep thinking, the lack of really grounding in ethics and care for just the human population in any given country. This is those in the developing world or other places will be the most hit by climate and other ecological change, but this will affect all of humanity. So this is very interesting to think about in terms of really the moral, deep moral problems we have at the moment. And the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists talking about, in terms of our spectrum of global risks, we're 90 seconds to midnight with the nuclear weapons of mass destruction risks, among others. And they actually note that the international political infrastructure has eroded. It's not just that it's inadequate to begin with, but it's also eroded because of these regressive trends of nationalism and also self-interested leaders, sadly, and a certain leadership model we have. We also have the arms races that are still alive and well. Unfortunately, Gorbachev, before he passed away, warned again about the unraveling of the treaties between Russia and the US. And this is just a chart that shows how few of those bilateral arms treaty, not just nuclear weapons, treaties are not in force. So again, this theme of great irresponsibility of current leadership modes and institutions. And in terms of the global governance perspective on weapons control in particular, this is a very old topic of concern to the international community. As early as 1899, the Russian Tsar called a Hague Peace Conference to look in particular about disarmament, yet we still have not sort of cracked this nut for a comprehensive global disarmament plan. And we do not hear this talked about also in mainstream society, an issue of urgent concern. It remains an issue of urgent concern. I have a slide later about the monetary waste of our current arms expenditures, but also, of course, the risks of further wars, further suffering. And coming back to this theme of leadership, there is this so-called fifth risk also of what is happening now in our societies with this runaway irresponsible leadership. And I think this is very interesting. If we're in a tumultuous sort of stormy adolescence of humanity, what is this sort of revealing to us about our leadership norms, our leadership models that are ego-based, that are skewed towards, of course, one gender and certain persons, of course, of privilege, to rethink, okay, how do we move to a collective leadership, an understated leadership, a humble servant leadership devoted to service, humility, excellence, constant learning? And how can we assist in mainstream culture to shift towards those leadership modes and styles? So the UN turned 75 a few years ago, and this was a comment by a special advisor for the UN 75 anniversary. and just noting, this intersection of challenges that we're facing, and that the UN is overburdened, is expected to deal with all of these issues, but under-resourced and in many respects frozen in time, without the vision in terms of how we evolve together our international governance. Another statement from the Secretary General upon the anniversary: we have a surplus of multilateral challenges, that is international challenges, and a deficit of international solutions that you would expect if you had a united world, if you had leaders really coming together with their hearts sincerely in it. How do we create trustworthy, rules-based systems that protect our common home of the planet, that protect all of us from the scourge of war, as it says in the preamble to the UN Charter? So basically, you may have heard that two other Baha'is and I won this international prize in 2018 on a new global governance model. So we have set out, some thoughts. It's a fairly long book, but it's available for free on the Cambridge University Press website. So we set out our suggestions for if, our thinking, and it's by no means the end statement. It's meant to be a sort of proposals for discussion. But in our minds, how could we evolve our shared international governance if we were going to take the next responsible steps to really deal with these global catastrophic risks we're confronting? And this is really this process of renewal, ever-advancing civilization, even, to use a Baha'i phrase. This notion of progress is really baked into international law and the international legal process, and into the UN Charter, for example, which is a very visionary instrument. It was supposed to be improved, elaborated. These Hague Peace Conferences also were so visionary, 1889, 1907, which laid the foundations of the League of Nations, then the United Nations. So you have seen these extraordinary progressive developments, but they're blocked now in so many ways. And the UN Charter hasn't been, of course, reformed for about 75 years, even though, according to one of its own specific articles, it was supposed to be reviewed generally within 10 years of its adoption. And this is just a very beautiful quotation from Eleanor Roosevelt, who is, of course, one of the mothers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, really clearly sharing that there is so much unfinished work to do in relation to the implementation of human rights around the world. This extraordinary visionary, it really a historical milestone, like just a profound historical shift with the adoption of the UN Charter, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we're still sort of locked and stunted. It's sort of like an arrested development in a lot of this very visionary fundamental work that we need to get done to actually, properly, competently manage as adults our global community. And, as an international lawyer, International Court of Justice, for example, has remained unreformed for 75 years. It's still optional. States can choose basically whether, with some exceptions, but can choose whether they wish to be subject to the jurisdiction of court, which of course is not how a court works in a national jurisdiction or any jurisdiction where you have a genuine rule of law. And I think this is also in terms of the quote from Eleanor Roosevelt about the work that has been left undone. This is such a beautiful statement from the first U.S. legal advisor who was one of the first judges on the International Court of Justice. He helped to draft the statute. He was helping the crafting of the UN Charter generally as part of the U.S. delegation in San Francisco. But there's a few quotes from him here, but he says there's the success of law and order among nations should be pursued with no less vigilance than the maintenance of law and order within nations. And he said this should be the preoccupation of all seriously minded people. So not just lawyers, but everyone should be thinking about this: how we increase the international rule of law to settle disputes peacefully between nations. So it really echoes to me Abdul Baha's tablet to The Hague, where he talks about, there's no greater concern to humanity than establishment of universal peace. But you find a lot of these really visionary figures throughout the history of international law who really had an extraordinary vision that we really need actually today. This is very modern still and very appropriate what he's saying. And then another wonderful legal scholar from around that time, Hans Kelsen, also noting that international law is so core and fundamental for a peaceful world. And in the book, I write a lot about how we would strengthen our international institutions in that respect. And there's also a couple of short papers or policy that I've written and a chapter, which are very accessible. They're very short if anyone is interested. And just quickly, a few of the other proposals from our book that are quite fundamental to an evolved, more mature international order. UN Security Council, of course, has not been reformed. It's added some members since 1945, but it has not shifted to a true paradigm of contemporary governance legitimacy, such as representation, equity, consultation, true consultation with all of the human family present. It's still sort of a might makes right sort of power-based paradigm that is still accepted by the internet. Largely, most of the international community has a lot of problems with that power imbalance. But the proposals for shifting to something truly values-based are very few and far between, to be honest. Also, as I mentioned, there's some articles on the disarmament issue. There's some articles in the UN Charter that mandated the Security Council to develop a plan for a comprehensive disarmament, and that was never done. So there's unfinished business in the Charter, and in our book we talk about, how we could make some steps forward on that and other issues. And as I was noting in the financial kind of implications for our weapons addiction and our sort of war society that we have as part of our international system, it's over $2 trillion now per year that's spent US dollars a year on armaments and weapons, and not to mention all of the scientific ingenuity, the engineering, technical ingenuity, technology that goes into military industrial complexes around the world, which could be focused on our real crises, our shared crises that we need to focus our energy on at the moment. And just on the broader UN reform topic, just to mention that there's some extraordinary campaigns, like-minded campaigns that any Baha'is can get involved with that are very harmonious with key Baha'i ideas. There's a parliamentary assembly, UN parliamentary assembly campaign that, for example, these Japanese members of the legislature endorse, EU legislators have endorsed, among many others. So just to let you know that there are many campaigns like this happening, but they haven't quite reached mainstream attention yet. So just in the last 7 minutes or so I have left, I'll just speed through some slides on this International Anti-Corruption Court project and then the Climate Governance Commission. And my apologies for the text-heavy slides. I can share them with the organizers if anyone's interested in more of the content, but I'll just have to go through them very quickly. So this International Anti-Corruption Court proposal was originally from a U.S. federal judge, Mark Wolf in the U.S., who worked on some very high-profile anti-corruption cases in the U.S., both at the national level and then at the state level. And dialoguing with judicial and prosecutorial colleagues around the world, he realized, by analogy from the US federal jurisdiction to state level jurisdiction, which was so helpful in tackling state level corruption in the US, a facility like this is needed at the international level. So US federalism as sort of a model for the international sphere, and that we need this international level to assist states that are really, really struggling with corruption at the national level. But it becomes like a state capture situation where the corrupt high-level officials also control the judiciary, prosecutors, et cetera. So it's sort of like a closed circle with massive humanitarian consequences. And anyways, this is just FYI, this is a film, a Scorsese film that was made on some of these anti-corruption cases that Judge Wolf was involved in. So this court proposal has its genesis, its main home in this small NGO in the US called Integrity Initiatives International, with a lot of extraordinary people on its board and supporting it. Just one example of the kind of people who are working on this topic. You can see there Judge Claudia Escobar, she was a Guatemalan judge who was trying to prosecute corruption cases, but had to leave the country because of threats to her and her family. And in this sphere, you meet a lot of people like that: prosecutors, judges, journalists who really put themselves in danger in trying to just apply the law, trying to apply truthfulness, integrity, trustworthiness in the public sphere, or other types of corruption. So it's really an extraordinary group of people who are working on this topic. And we have at the moment quite an incredible amount of growing country support. Canada, Netherlands, Nigeria, Ecuador, Timor-Leste, Moldova have supported this International Anti-Corruption Court proposal. And there's also growing civil society support. And we will have a meeting at the end of August, in just a week, in Hamburg, to really deepen our treaty development. So how do we develop a new instrument for this court to make it a state-of-the-art court, to learn from the International Criminal Court experience, and to adapt to the needs of this area of anti-corruption law, and to also make sure it responds to the needs of all regions of the world, which of course is a challenge. And we have to have very deep consultations with experts and NGO officials, et cetera, who are working in various country landscapes. So I'm just going to speed through all these slides, and I can on the IACC, but I can share them with organizers later if anyone is interested in more detail. And then I'll just, to end, say a few words about this Climate Governance Commission that I'm spending now about 75% of my time on. So yes, in the area of climate risk, it's particularly obvious at this point that we're so vulnerable to these huge risks we're running because of inadequate governance, basically inadequate international cooperation, inadequate close coordination, thinking together. How do we really tackle this quintessential like planetary issue together, and to really swiftly and responsibly take the action needed? So it's sort of quite glaring on what we're confronting at the moment. So the Climate Governance Commission, we've done an interim report noting also in this area that we have actually a lot of the solutions. We have the theory, we have the technology, we have adequate technology, but there's like basically, it could be diagnosed as a moral and action-based gap. We have solutions, but there is not the adequate action. We also don't have the key collective policies being implemented at this speed and scale. We need them to be implemented. So again, like a leadership or like a collective responsibilities sort of gap. And then we talk about this global or international governance gap also. And again, this is a pathway. We have the solutions across sectors, but we have not come together to the extent needed, really the level of sort of emergency response needed at the international level to really make sure we meet all these targets. So I'll just go through this and maybe just end with sharing with you, some of the reports that we've prepared and commissioned on the Climate Governance Commission, really taking this international cooperation and global governance lens. For example, there's an article written on a global environment agency that scientists have been suggesting and asking for many years, but there's been such psychological and political resistance to it. And then other ways, how do we accelerate our action and dealing with our shared problems through international collaboration, as our superpower, rather than superpower politics? How do we use international collaboration as really the superpower of the now and the future? So I might just end there. There's some of our commission members. You see Mary Robinson, who's the chair of the elders, that was founded by Nelson Mandela. She was, of course, the first female head of state in Ireland, or president in Ireland. You see Johan Rockström, who's an incredible planetary scientist. Maria Fernanda Espinosa, who is one of the first women presidents of the UN General Assembly. Wanjira Maathai from Kenya, head of World Resource Institute there. So Maldives, you see the permanent representative from the Maldives, a small island state that is absolutely fundamentally at risk as a nation because of climate change. So we're all trying to work together to help with some perspectives that we hope will be helpful for the international community. So I think I'll stop there, and then we can discuss and have some questions as people wish.
Thank you so much, Maja. That was really wonderful. And I think, having heard from Paddy to begin with about some of the qualities which, as a Baha'i institution, might be striving towards in terms of governance, is very, very interesting to hear from you, almost from the ground, on some of the maybe a little bit bleak, but also very, very interesting issues that are coming up in global governance in a wider sense in the world. We do have some questions, so I'll pass them on to you. I think the first few questions are actually quite related, so I'll ask them both to you at once. Sasha and one anonymous attendee, these are the questions from them. So the first question is, how can a National Assembly govern in the area of climate change impact, and what might be some helpful lines of action? And the second question is, what contributions has the Baha'i community, both in practice or in theory, made on a global scale to protect the environment?
Yeah, wonderful. So I think the NSA, what NSAs can do in terms of climate, constructive climate governance or impact, responsible sort of ways forward where the NSA can have an impact. I think there would likely be many, in fact, and that's sort of like a general non-specific answer, but I also say that because I think there are a lot of excellent resources at the moment for climate action across various spheres of activity and including for very grassroots communities, but also excellent educational materials. I know the Baha'i community in Glasgow for COP26 produced a really wonderful individual sort of suggestion pack for how individuals could kind of transition lifestyle to have less climate impact. But I would think it would need the development of a plan. It would require some reflection and consultation in terms of what could be the most effective pathways of actions. And I think that would be extraordinary, because then it could also be the Baha'i community putting values, perspectives into practice. And I have not seen any NSA plans on climate change, but I'm happy to share, brainstorm with anyone about potential resources and perspectives afterwards if there's an interest. And then in terms of what the Baha'i community has done in theory and practice, Marlon, was that about climate change in particular, or the environment or sustainability?
I think it said just just to protect the environment. So I
Okay.
suppose climate change.
Yeah. So I would refer everybody to the International Environment Forum, which is a Baha'i-inspired organization, which is an excellent organization. Arthur Dahl is, I think, still the head of it. And it's a collection of, it's Baha'i inspired with many Baha'is and non-Baha'is around the world. And what I have seen, and others might have other stories or information to share, but I have seen a lot of activity, like individual Baha'is working really, really hard and devoted in this area for the environment and sustainability, very much grounded in Baha'i values, which are about respecting nature, the planet as, you know, creation and something that, and we need to care for, you know, other life on earth. That's very fundamental to the Baha'i faith, and also caring for each other. And often environmental challenges are interlinked with economic inequalities, poverty, corruption. So working also on those social problems that really have a terrible impact on the environment. So I know of a multitude of people and projects, you know, Baha'is who are working on environmental projects. So, but I think the IEF, International Environment Forum, is an excellent place to start. And just to mention just one of many examples, you know, one of the architects of the Paris Agreement, this current climate agreement that we have, we'd be much worse off if we didn't have it, I can assure you that. It's not adequate yet, but there was a Baha'i working on that as one of the key architects. So you find people who are working very hard in diverse sets of circumstances and at various levels.
Okay, so we have some more questions. Also, I'm sorry, I've been informed that my internet connection isn't the best. So sorry if you're not hearing me too well. But okay, so your work, how common is it to have professionals consider the climate crisis as a moral or spiritual issue?
Yeah, it's not extremely common.
It's not extremely common. I would say
there's an echo. I think, Malin, you might need to mute yourself.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I think there is sort of like a strand of sort of thinking and vocalization that there are these spiritual or moral, mostly moral dimensions, but it's very rare. I'd say there's a quote from Gus Speth, who's this a scientist who says, you know, I used to think science could solve the climate crisis, but no, it's a moral or spiritual crisis or problem. But that's sort of, it's not a mainstream view, and I think that's another opportunity to really discuss and think deeply, because I think that would be very helpful. That would be very helpful for the practical work that we need to do, and the practical transformations we need to really get busy on. So it's not very common, but I think one would find quite a lot of welcome sort of receptivity to such ideas at this point, because I think at this point, many in these policy circles really understand how grave the climate crisis is based on the science. Should I go on to the next question, Melon?
Yeah, sure. I'll read it out for the.
Okay.
So there is a question saying, what in your experience are your colleagues' view of the limits of humanity's ability to organise? I ask because it seems to me that international civil servants can imagine change that could happen in one generation, but anything that would take more than one generation is almost impossible to imagine.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I very much agree with that impression. One book that I really appreciate is, I think it was published in 2020 by Toby Ord, called The Precipice, which is, he's an Australian philosopher now in the UK. But he talks about these various planetary existential risks as he sees them. He sort of ranks what he thinks are the most dangerous to humanity. But climate, ecological collapse is one of them, among others, AI risks, etc. But he talks about, the human propensity at the moment, just generally across our societies, not just civil servants, but including civil servants, to think only about, in such a short time horizon. So I think his book is actually a really interesting, useful starting place. Also, he talks about the current civil servants and policymakers, this inability to kind of get their heads around the planetary scale and this planetary community. Like, the national perspective is still so dominant. Like, okay, we're beholden to our electorate. There's a 5-year cycle or 4 or 3-year cycle or whatever it is. And there's just so many incentives to kind of be very short term. And again, not the wisdom or the resources, the intellectual, philosophical, spiritual, other resources to like dig deep into, to have this planetary, the broader, the ethical, the 7 generations, of course, in some indigenous traditions. So this is another area that is so ripe for further discussion, dialogue, discourse, and then, practical application. And you see a little bit of it, nascent in some of the future generation work and discourses. Like now they're trying to establish a special envoy for future generations at the UN, and the Secretary General suggested like the UN Trusteeship Council in part be revamped for global commons and thinking about future generations. So we have some of it starting. So again, there's sort of potentially fertile soil for this deeper and long-term thinking. And it will be a huge relief for humanity and everybody if we kind of really internalize this and understand this, because it's absolutely where we have to go in terms of our thinking.
That's really, really fascinating. I think we have time for maybe one more question. So this is a more kind of technical question about the UN from Sam Taylor, who says, do you think that the UNA should be reformed on the basis of a representative parliamentary system, much like the European Parliament, but with full legislative powers? Should it also have an elected executive body to replace the Security Council? So some questions about UN governance.
Yes, thank you, Sam. And it sounds like you have, it sounds like maybe you were thinking along the lines we were thinking in our book, which is, again, available open source, so nobody has to buy it. We talk about, indeed, in terms of the Security Council, an executive body that would replace the Security Council, that would be there would be kind of elections or consensus building within different regions to have the individuals on the Security Council, or this new Security Council, which is an executive council, rather than being elected per se. But in our, vision of one model of how we could go forward, this new executive council would be sort of subordinate to a legislative function that indeed the UN General Assembly, we thought, should be transformed into a legislative body with some powers to issue binding legislation for the world with direct effect for areas, not unlike the EU, for areas that are quintessentially international, following a principle of subsidiarity, where, issues, governance is handled at the most local level possible, but for, of course, key global international issues, some of which I've spoken about today, some of these really, really, really do need international legislation and governance. So anyways, I'd invite you just to look more at the book if you want to see what we sketched out in the book in terms of the parliamentary facilities. We have, I think, 3 chapters on how that could work, and then a chapter on the Transforming UN Security Council. And just to say, again, it's just one suggestion, one model, one blueprint, which I would want, discussed much, much more. What is the best design, given the various models we have, for example, the EU level, at national levels, to make it like a very healthy legislative function, which isn't, so prone to terrible partisan politics or doesn't have partisan politics? Or how would we structure it to be a genuine assembly of humanity, with the right kind of tone and dynamics.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much, Maja. That was a really, really wonderful way for us to start the day. And thank you so much for joining from the airport. So bye, Maja, and thank you very, very much.